My house burned down with my kids inside, so I ran to my parents' door. But they said, "Your dead children aren't welcome here." Hey beautiful souls. Take a second to subscribe, drop a friendly hi in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Now let's continue the story. The door slammed in my face so hard the brass knocker rattled like gunfire. I stood there, soot-streaked and shaking, holding two small urns against my chest while my mother's voice echoed through the mahogany. "Your dead children aren't welcome in this house, Alice. Neither are you." Behind me, the taxi driver cleared his throat. "Ma'am, you want me to wait?" His eyes darted from my ash-stained dress to the ceramic containers in my arms. I'd buried my babies 2 hours ago. 7-year-old Rowan. 5-year-old Alma. The fire department said it was electrical. Old wiring in my rental house. They died in their sleep from smoke inhalation while I worked the night shift at the hospital. I turned back to the door, pressing my palm against its familiar surface. This was the house where I'd grown up, where my children had spent countless weekends, where they'd learned to ride bikes in the circular driveway. "Mama, please," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I lost everything. I just need." "You need nothing from us," came my father's voice, cold and final. "You made your choices, Alice. Married that no-good man against our wishes. Moved to that trashy neighborhood. Now look what happened." The taxi driver was definitely staring now. Mrs. Henderson from next door had appeared at her window, phone pressed to her ear. I could practically hear the whispers starting already in our upscale subdivision. My knees buckled slightly as the weight of the urn seemed to triple. "The children never did anything wrong," I said louder now. "They loved you. They called you Grandmama, and those children are gone." My mother's voice cut through like ice. "And we have a reputation to maintain. We can't have you bringing this tragedy to our doorstep." 6 months earlier, everything had been different. I was scrambling eggs in my tiny kitchen while Rowan helped Alma tie her shoes for school. The house was small, cramped, but it was ours. Well rented, but it felt like home. The yellow walls were covered with the kids' artwork, and every surface held some trace of our life together. "Mama, can we go to Grandmama's house this weekend?" Alma had asked, her gap-toothed smile melting my heart. I'd hesitated, spatula suspended over the pan. My parents had been increasingly cold since my divorce from Deshaun 2 years prior. They'd never approved of him, and when he left me for his secretary, they acted like it was somehow my fault for not keeping him satisfied. "We'll see, baby," I'd said, the same answer I always gave. Rowan looked up from his homework at the kitchen table. "They never want to see us anymore, do they?" The question hit me like a physical blow. My 7-year-old shouldn't have to notice such things. "That's not true, sweetheart. They're just busy." But even then I knew he was right. The last visit had been strained. My mother had criticized everything from the kids' table manners to their clothes. Second-hand finds from Goodwill that I'd carefully selected and mended. "These children need structure," she'd said, as if I wasn't doing everything in my power to provide it. My father had been worse, barely acknowledging them, absorbed in his business calls even during dinner. When Rowan had excitedly shown him a drawing, Dad had glanced at it dismissively and said, "Very nice," before returning to his phone. The eggs were burning. I flipped them quickly, trying to salvage breakfast while battling the growing knot in my stomach. My parents' rejection hurt, but their rejection of my children was unbearable. I should have been home. That thought circled my mind like a vulture as I stood in Detective Morrison's sterile office 3 days after the funeral. The fire had started at 2:17 a.m. according to the report. I'd been at the hospital covering for a colleague who'd called in sick. A single mother's dilemma: turn down overtime and struggle to pay bills, or take it and leave your children with Mrs. Rosario, the elderly neighbor who'd fallen asleep on my couch. "The investigation is closed," Detective Morrison said, sliding the file across his desk. "Electrical fire. Old house, older wiring. These things happen." But something felt wrong. The fire had been too hot, too fast. The neighbor said they'd heard what sounded like glass breaking before they saw flames. Mrs. Rosario had been found unconscious in the living room, overcome by smoke before she could get to the children's bedroom. "What about the insurance investigation?" I asked. Morrison's expression shifted slightly. "Already cleared. Your landlord's company paid out. Case closed." But I never got. "Ma'am, you need to focus on moving forward. Grief counseling, finding a place to stay. Let the dead rest." His words stung, but I caught something else in his tone. Finality that felt forced. I took the file and left, but the questions multiplied in my head like cancer cells. Why had the fire burned so hot? Why hadn't Mrs. Rosario heard the smoke alarm? Why was the insurance investigation concluded so quickly? That night, staying at the Holiday Inn with money borrowed from my coworkers, I spread the file contents across the polyester bedspread. Photos of my destroyed home, technical reports I couldn't fully understand, witness statements. But buried in the paperwork, I found something odd. A property assessment dated just 1 week before the fire. The house I'd rented for 3 years was suddenly worth twice what I'd thought. Someone had been very interested in that lot. My phone rang at 6 a.m. sharp, jolting me from the first real sleep I'd had in weeks. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, unfamiliar. "Ms. Williams? This is Patricia Kelman from Kelman Barnes & Associates. I need to meet with you regarding your children's estate." Their estate. I sat up in the hotel bed, confused. They were children. They didn't have an estate. On the contrary. Your son Rowan was the beneficiary of a substantial trust fund established by your late grandmother, Delilah Williams. Since he's deceased, the funds transfer to his living relatives. That would be you. My hands shook as I gripped the phone. Grandma Delilah had died when I was 15. She'd been my refuge, the one adult who'd truly understood me. But a trust fund? How much are we talking about? $750,000. Plus accumulated interest over the past 23 years. The total is approximately $1.2 million. The room spun. I gripped the nightstand to steady myself. That's impossible. My parents never mentioned. Your parents were the trustees until Rowan turned 18. The trust documents are quite clear. They were responsible for managing the funds and ensuring Rowan received proper notification on his 18th birthday. Rowan would have turned 18 in 11 years. My parents had known about this money for over 2 decades. They'd watched me struggle as a single mother, working double shifts, clipping coupons, buying secondhand clothes for their grandchildren. They'd known about the money and never said a word. "Ms. Williams? Are you there?" "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "When can we meet?" An hour later, I sat in Patricia Kelman's downtown office, staring at documents that changed everything. My grandmother's careful handwriting filled the margins of the original trust paperwork. Notes about wanting to ensure her great-grandchildren's education, their security, their dreams. "Your grandmother was very specific," Patricia said, adjusting her glasses. "The money was for Rowan and any future children he might have. Since he's deceased with no offspring, it reverts to the bloodline, to you. And my parents controlled this for 23 years? They were required to provide annual statements to the court. They consistently reported attempts to locate you and your children were unsuccessful." My blood turned to ice. Unsuccessful? I've lived in the same city my entire adult life. They had my address, my phone number. Patricia's expression darkened. "Ms. Williams, I think you need to see these." She handed me a stack of court documents. Page after page of my father's signatures, swearing under oath that he'd tried repeatedly to contact me. Fake addresses. Disconnected phone numbers. Claims that I'd moved out of state, that I was unreachable, possibly deceased. 23 years of lies. While I'd begged them for help, while I'd brought their grandchildren to their door seeking love and acceptance, they'd been stealing from those same children. Not just money, their future, their security, their grandmother's final gift. I drove to my parents' house the next morning with Patricia's business card burning in my pocket and photocopies of the trust documents on my passenger seat. The familiar white columns of their colonial revival home looked different now, built on lies, polished with stolen money that should have paid for my children's college funds, their music lessons, their dreams. My mother answered the door wearing her usual mask of disdain. "Alice, we told you. We need to talk." I pushed past her into the marble foyer. The house smelled like expensive potpourri and guilt. About Grandma Delilah's trust fund. My mother's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about." $750,000. Plus interest. Money that belonged to Rowan. My voice was steady now, surgical in its precision. "Money you stole for 23 years while I worked myself to death trying to provide for those children." My father appeared in the doorway of his study, his face carefully neutral. "You're upset, Alice. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. I pulled out the documents. Annual reports to the probate court. Your signature, Dad. Swearing under oath that you couldn't find me. Want to explain how that worked when I brought your grandchildren here every month? The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. My mother sank into her velvet chair, all pretense finally dropping. My father's jaw worked soundlessly. We were protecting that money, he finally said. You weren't ready for that kind of responsibility. Look at the choices you made, that man you married, that neighborhood you lived in. You would have wasted it. So you decided to steal it instead? We never touched a penny, my mother shrieked. It's all there, every cent. Invested in what? I asked quietly. This house. Your cars. Your precious reputation. My father's silence was answer enough. Those children died in a rental house with faulty wiring because their mother couldn't afford anything better, I said, my voice breaking. They died while their inheritance sat in an account you controlled. I hired a private investigator named James Tucker, a former police detective who specialized in financial crimes. His office was above a coffee shop in downtown Atlanta. Nothing fancy, but his credentials were impeccable. More importantly, he had a reputation for taking on cases where money and power tried to bury the truth. Your parents are smart, he said after reviewing the documents. They invested the trust money, but they kept meticulous records showing it all belongs to the estate. Legally, they're protected. But morally? That's a different conversation. James leaned back in his chair. Tell me about the fire again. Something's bothering me. I repeated what I knew, watching his expression change as I mentioned the property assessment, the quick insurance settlement, Detective Morrison's eagerness to close the case. Your landlord, James said. Franklin Properties. Who owns that? Some corporation. Why? He was already typing on his computer. Franklin Properties, subsidiary of Morrison Holdings, which is owned by. His eyebrows rose. Oh well. Morrison Holdings is owned by your parents, Alice. Your children died in a house your parents owned. The room tilted. That's impossible. I wrote rent checks to Franklin Properties for 3 years. A shell company. Your parents were your landlords. They knew about the electrical problems because they owned the building. James printed out the corporate filings. Look at this. They purchased that property 2 years ago, right after your divorce. The same month you moved in. My hands shook as I read the documents. My parents hadn't just stolen my children's inheritance. They'd put my children in danger. The faulty wiring, the delayed repairs I'd begged for, the rent increases that kept me trapped there. It was all them. There's more, James said softly. The property assessment you found? That was for redevelopment. Your parents had plans to tear down that entire block and build a shopping center. But they needed the tenants out first. You think they started the fire? I think they neglected dangerous conditions in a property they owned, knowing it would eventually force you out. I don't think they intended for anyone to die. But intent didn't matter. My children were gone and my parents' greed had put them in harm's way. The next 3 weeks blurred together in a haze of legal documents, bank records, and sleepless nights. James worked with the efficiency of a surgeon, peeling back layers of financial deception that stretched back decades. What we found made me physically sick. My parents hadn't just stolen the trust money, they'd used it as collateral for their entire lifestyle. The big house, the luxury cars, my father's failing consulting business, all of it leveraged against money that belonged to my children. They're over-leveraged by about $2 million, James explained, spreading bank statements across his desk. They borrowed heavily, assuming the trust money would always be there to cover their debts. Now that you're the rightful heir and demanding the funds, they're facing bankruptcy. Good, I said, surprised by the venom in my own voice. Here's where it gets interesting. James pulled out another file. The insurance payout on your rental house? That went directly to your parents as the property owners. They collected $400,000 for a building they'd neglected to death. My children's lives had become a business transaction. I thought I'd cried all my tears at the funeral, but fresh ones came now, hot, angry, and full of purpose. There's something else, James continued. Detective Morrison? His daughter works for your father's consulting firm. Has for 3 years. The pieces clicked into place. The rushed investigation, the closed case, the insurance company's quick settlement. It was all connected. My parents hadn't just covered up their negligence. They'd profited from it. What kind of consulting does my father do? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Risk management for property development companies. Specializes in helping clients minimize liability in accident cases. I stared at him, speechless. My father was an expert in covering up exactly the kind of tragedy that had killed his grandchildren. Alice, James said gently, I think we have enough to reopen the criminal investigation. Your parents may not have started the fire, but they created the conditions that made it deadly. Then they covered it up and profited from it. Will they go to prison? If we can prove criminal negligence and conspiracy, yes. But it's going to be a fight. They have money, connections, and a lot to lose. Good, I repeated. Let them lose everything. Word travels fast in Atlanta's legal community, especially when it involves a story as explosive as mine. Within days of James filing paperwork to reopen the investigation, I started receiving calls from unexpected allies. The first was Sarah Rosario, Mrs. Rosario's granddaughter and a civil rights attorney. My grandmother still has nightmares, she told me over coffee. She blames herself for falling asleep for not saving your children. When she learned about your parents' involvement, she wanted to help. Mrs. Rosario had noticed things the night of the fire, small details that hadn't made it into the official report. The smell of gasoline near the back door. The fact that the smoke alarms never sounded, even though she'd helped me test them just weeks before. Most importantly, she'd seen a car parked across the street earlier that evening, someone sitting inside watching the house. The second ally was Judge Rebecca Martinez, who'd presided over the probate court when my parents filed their annual trust reports. I remember your father, she said during our meeting in her chambers. Something about his demeanor always bothered me. Too smooth, too prepared. Like he was reciting a script. Judge Martinez agreed to review the trust case and consider sanctions for perjury. More importantly, she had connections throughout the justice system. Prosecutors who owed her favors, investigators who respected her judgment. The third ally was the most surprising. Deshaun, my ex-husband. I hadn't spoken to him since the divorce, but he showed up at my hotel room door one evening with tears in his eyes. I heard what happened, he said. About the kids, about your parents. I know we had our problems, Alice, but Rowan and Alma didn't deserve this. It turned out Deshaun had his own information about my parents. During our marriage, they'd approached him multiple times, trying to convince him to keep me away from family gatherings, to move us farther from Atlanta. They'd even offered him money to relocate to another state. I thought they just didn't like me, he admitted. I never realized they were trying to hide something. Together we began to build a comprehensive case. Bank records, property documents, witness statements, expert testimony about the fire's origin and spread. Most importantly, we found other victims, tenants in my parents' other properties who'd complained about safety issues, only to be ignored or evicted. My parents weren't just negligent landlords. They were predators who used substandard housing to extract maximum profit from vulnerable families, then discarded them when problems arose. The first public hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in Judge Martinez's courtroom. I arrived early wearing my best dress, a navy blue number I'd bought for job interviews, and carrying a folder containing 23 years of stolen dreams. My parents entered with their attorney, a slick man in an expensive suit who barely acknowledged me. They looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow. My mother clutched her purse like a lifeline, while my father maintained his business facade, nodding professionally at his lawyer. This is about greed disguised as guardianship, Patricia Kelman began her opening statement. For over 2 decades, the defendants controlled a trust fund worth over $1 million while allowing their daughter and grandchildren to live in poverty. The courtroom was packed. Word had leaked to the press. A story involving generational wealth, family betrayal, and children's deaths was catnip for local news outlets. I spotted reporters in the back rows, cameras positioned discreetly near the doors. My parents' attorney argued that they'd been conservative trustees, protecting the money from my poor life choices and financial irresponsibility. He painted a picture of a devoted grandparent's dilemma, watching their daughter make mistake after mistake while trying to preserve their grandchildren's future. The tragedy of the fire doesn't change the fact that my clients acted within their legal authority as trustees, he concluded. Then Patricia called her first witness, Mrs. Rosario. The elderly woman walked slowly to the witness stand, using her cane for support. In her accented English, she described the night of the fire, the details that had haunted her dreams. But more importantly, she talked about my children. Rowan, he was so smart, she said, tears sliding down her weathered cheeks. He helped me with my English, read to me from his school books. Alma, she draw me pictures, call me Grandma Rosario. Good children. They deserve better. The courtroom was silent except for the soft scratch of reporters' pens. My parents stared at their hands, unable to meet Mrs. Rosario's gaze. James Tucker took the stand next, methodically presenting the financial evidence. Shell companies, fraudulent court filings, the property ownership connection, he laid it out with the precision of a surgeon. The defendants didn't just steal money, he testified. They actively concealed their relationship to the property where the children died, preventing proper safety oversight and emergency response. By lunch break, the tide had turned. I could see it in the reporters' excited conversations, in the way people looked at my parents as they left the courtroom. The story was no longer about a family dispute. It was about children who died because of their grandparents' greed. The second day of hearings brought Detective Morrison to the witness stand. Judge Martinez had subpoenaed him after James presented evidence of his connection to my father's business. Morrison sat rigidly upright, his uniform crisp but his face pale. Detective Morrison, Patricia began, you were the lead investigator on the fire that killed Rowan and Alma Williams, correct? Yes. And you concluded the investigation within 48 hours? The cause was obvious. Electrical fire. These things happen in older buildings. Did you know that the property was owned by the victim's grandparents through a shell corporation? Morrison's jaw tightened. That information wasn't relevant to determining fire causation. Wasn't relevant? Patricia's voice rose. The property owners had received multiple complaints about electrical problems from the tenant, their own daughter, and failed to address them. That wasn't relevant. I investigated the fire's origin and cause. Property ownership disputes are civil matters. Patricia pulled out a thick folder. Your daughter Rebecca Morrison has worked for defendant Charles Williams's consulting firm for 3 years, earning $85,000 annually. Did you disclose this conflict of interest? The courtroom erupted in whispers. Morrison's face flushed red. My daughter's employment had nothing to do with my investigation. Your daughter's employment was directly dependent on Mr. Williams's goodwill. The same Mr. Williams whose negligence potentially caused the fire that killed his grandchildren. Judge Martinez banged her gavel for order, but the damage was done. Morrison's credibility was shattered and the cover-up was exposed. The next witness was Dr. Angela Foster, a fire investigator I'd hired independently. She'd reviewed the evidence with fresh eyes and reached different conclusions. The fire burned too hot and spread too quickly for a simple electrical malfunction, she testified. The pattern suggests an accelerant was present, likely gasoline or another petroleum product. Are you saying someone started this fire deliberately? I'm saying the evidence is consistent with arson, but I can't determine intent. Someone could have stored gasoline improperly, or used it for lawn equipment near the electrical source. Without a proper investigation at the time, we may never know exactly what happened. But we knew enough. My parents had put my children in a death trap, ignored their safety and then covered up their negligence for profit. My parents' attorney wasn't finished fighting. On the third day he called character witnesses, friends from their country club, business associates, even their pastor, who painted them as pillars of the community who'd made difficult decisions with good intentions. Charles Williams is a respected businessman who's created jobs and contributed to countless charities, testified Richard Hartwell, president of their homeowners association. He and Eleanor are devoted grandparents who tried to protect their family's financial future. But Patricia was ready with her cross-examination. Mr. Hartwell, are you aware that Mr. Williams's charitable contributions were funded by a trust account that belonged to his deceased grandchildren? No, I wasn't aware of the specific funding sources. Are you aware that his successful business is leveraged against stolen money and is currently facing bankruptcy? One by one, the character witnesses crumbled under scrutiny. Their testimonies revealed not pillars of the community, but a facade propped up by lies and other people's money. Then my mother took the stand. Eleanor Williams had aged dramatically in the past weeks. Her usually perfect hair was showing gray roots, and her hands shook as she swore to tell the truth. My father's attorney had coached her well. She spoke about the pain of losing her grandchildren, the impossible position of managing someone else's money, the fear that I would waste the inheritance on bad choices. We only wanted what was best for those children, she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. We planned to give them everything when they were older, more mature. How could we have known? She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The courtroom was silent, some people clearly moved by what appeared to be genuine grief. But Patricia's cross-examination was surgical. Mrs. Williams, you testified that you planned to give your grandchildren their inheritance when they were more mature. Rowan would have received his funds at 18, in 11 years. How exactly were you planning to give him money from an account that you'd already spent? My mother's composure cracked. We were going to replace it. With what money? Your husband's consulting business is failing. Your home is mortgaged to its full value. Your personal accounts show a negative net worth of over $2 million. We would have found a way. By collecting insurance money from the property where your grandchildren died? The question hung in the air like poison gas. My mother stared at Patricia, mouth opening and closing soundlessly. In that moment, the entire courtroom saw what I'd known all along. My parents weren't grieving grandparents who'd made difficult choices. They were criminals who'd profited from their grandchildren's deaths. Judge Martinez took 3 days to render her decision. When court reconvened the following Monday, the gallery was packed beyond capacity. Local news stations had picked up the story and it had gone viral on social media. #Justice for Rowan and Alma was trending on Twitter. This court finds the defendants in contempt of their fiduciary duties as trustees, Judge Martinez began, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Furthermore, this court finds evidence of fraud, perjury, and criminal negligence that will be referred to the district attorney for prosecution. My parents' attorney objected, but Judge Martinez silenced him with a look. The defendants will immediately transfer all trust assets to the rightful heir, Alice Williams. Additionally, they will pay restitution for investment losses, legal fees, and damages in the amount of $2.3 million. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed for the doors, phones pressed to their ears. My parents sat frozen, the reality of their situation finally sinking in. But Judge Martinez wasn't finished. This court is also ordering the immediate seizure of all properties owned by Morrison Holdings and its subsidiaries pending investigation into safety violations that contributed to the deaths of Rowan and Alma Williams. My father stood up abruptly, his face purple with rage. You can't do this. We have rights. We were trying to protect. Sit down, Mr. Williams, Judge Martinez commanded. You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you exercise it, as anything you say can and will be used against you in the criminal proceedings that will surely follow. Court officers moved toward my father, hands resting on their restraints. He sat down heavily, all the fight drained out of him. Outside the courthouse, I faced a wall of microphones and cameras. The questions came rapid fire. How did it feel to win? Would I forgive my parents? What would I do with the money? This was never about money, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos around me. This was about justice for 2 children who deserved better. Rowan and Alma will never get to grow up, never get to use their inheritance for college or their dreams. But their story will ensure that other children are protected from the kind of neglect and greed that killed them. I walked away from the cameras toward James Tucker's car, leaving my parents to face the reporters alone. For the first time in months, I felt something approaching peace. The system had worked. Justice, delayed and nearly denied, had finally arrived. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of the Rowan and Alma Williams Foundation, looking out at faces I'd never expected to see united in common purpose. Sarah Rosario sat at the head of the table, now serving as the foundation's legal counsel. James Tucker had transitioned from private investigator to full-time child advocate. Even Deshawn was there, having quit his job to help establish our safe housing initiative. We'd used the restored trust money and the court-ordered restitution to create something beautiful from tragedy. The foundation provided emergency housing for families displaced by unsafe living conditions, legal advocacy for tenants facing negligent landlords, and educational grants for children whose families struggled financially. Our first major project was purchasing and renovating the entire block where my rental house had stood. Where my children died, we built a community center with after-school programs, a health clinic, and truly affordable housing with the highest safety standards. The Williams Act passed the state legislature yesterday, Sarah announced to applause around the table. The legislation required landlords to disclose property ownership chains and mandated immediate safety inspections following tenant complaints. It would be signed into law on what would have been Rowan's 8th birthday. My parents had been sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for fraud and perjury. They'd lost their home, their cars, their reputation. Everything they'd valued more than their grandchildren's lives. My mother wrote me letters from prison, letters I returned unopened. Forgiveness might come someday, but not yet. Maybe never. The criminal charges for negligent homicide were still pending, but Detective Morrison had been forced to resign in disgrace, and the fire investigation had been reopened. Dr. Foster's team had found evidence of multiple code violations dating back years, building a strong case for criminal negligence. As I walked home that evening through the streets of my old neighborhood, now transformed but still affordable, I carried 2 photos in my purse. Rowan grinning gap-toothed at his school science fair. Alma covered in finger paint from head to toe, proud of her latest masterpiece. They were gone, but their legacy lived on in every family we helped, every child we protected, every landlord who now thought twice before ignoring safety concerns. Their deaths had meaning beyond tragedy. They'd become a catalyst for change that would protect countless other children. I reached the small apartment I now called home, 3 blocks from the community center that bore their names. It wasn't fancy, but it was safe, inspected, and honestly managed. On my kitchen table sat the latest progress report from the foundation. We'd helped 847 families in 6 months. We'd forced 12 negligent landlords to make critical safety repairs. We'd prevented who knows how many other fires, other tragedies, other children from dying because of adult greed and negligence. Before bed, I opened the memory box I kept on my dresser. Photos, artwork, report cards, pieces of 2 precious lives cut short. But as I looked at their smiling faces, I no longer saw only loss. I saw purpose. I saw justice. I saw love that had transcended death to become something powerful and protective and permanent. My children were gone, but their light burned on in every life we saved, every family we helped, every child who would sleep safely because Rowan and Alma Williams had not died in vain. That night, for the first time since the fire, I slept peacefully. Justice, once delayed, had not only arrived, it had grown into something beautiful and lasting. Something worthy of 2 children who had deserved so much more than they received, but whose brief lives had ultimately changed the world for countless others. The door that had been slammed in my face had become a gateway to justice. And through that gateway, Rowan and Alma's legacy would live forever.